Hi, hello. Welcome back to Module 1, where we're going to be discussing 1.4. It has been a pleasure. My name is Jair Torres, and I'm again with you on this MOOC on resilience schools and disaster risk reduction education. So, we're going to be discussing here about linking the humanitarian and development agendas, which we believe is very important nowadays. So this module will be discussing the disaster cycle. So we're going to introduce one of the first elements of the of disasters, that is the disaster cycle. Then we're going to be talking about the humanitarian development peace nexus, and we're going to finish, integrating or putting the comprehensive school safety framework and education in emergencies in the humanitarian development peace nexus. So I hope that you will enjoy this course and that you have been enjoying the previous ones that were provided by my colleagues. So the disaster cycle. So as you know, this is how it looks, the disaster cycle that has traditionally been introduced like that. So normally in normal times, you will have all the times to prevent and mitigate the impacts that different hazards can cause on schools and can cause on education. So you can prevent all these kind of negative impacts, and you can mitigate the impacts either on the infrastructure and either on the educational continuity, etc., etc. So you prepare for that, and this is the second part of the disaster cycle. You prepare, a part of prevent and mitigate, you prepare for the moment when something will arrive. And when something will arrive is when we will be discussing about the disaster impact. This disaster impact, that is something that you will see here, will produce with all the negative effects that we know. So the first thing that we have to come there is the response. How we're going to respond to that specific disasters, and how the education system need to respond and adapt to in the terms or in the periods of disasters. And then we start all the process of recovery and reconstruction, on which one we will go back, or we will try to go back to the stage that we were before the impact of the disasters. Nevertheless, I would like to tell you that this disaster cycle, very traditional, has been evolving now, and we have something that now is a little bit more complex, but that introduced the two subjects that we wanted to see here: development components and humanitarian components. So here is where we are starting putting a little bit more of complexity to the disaster cycle, and we say that it's not only about mitigation and prevention and including preparedness, but also about how early warning systems and possible prediction of specific hazard impacts can be included in the management. And when we are talking about the risk management cycle, we are talking about development issues. So how we build and how we align all the developments in the education sector, in the planning of the education sector, with mitigation and prevention activities, with preparedness activities, and with early warning systems and prevention. And all this part is something that is in the framework of protection: how we protect our schools, how we protect our educational system, how we protect our child. And then there is the disaster that could happen, and that is where the humanitarian actors will enter there, and that will be on the crisis management. So we, as I mentioned before, in the traditional cycle, we'll have the response. Then after the response, we will have the impact assessment. So normally we start responding before we can have an impact assessment, and that is where some methodologies like the PDNA that has been produced by the UN enters in consideration. And here is where we're going to start understanding, for instance, what are the urgent needs that the disaster has been putting and making evident, and how with that disaster, with that impact assessment, we can start preparing for recovery and preparing for the reconstruction. So this is the cycle part that is related to crisis management and that is related to the recovery. So this is how the disaster cycle now is evolving, and it's very important for us to understand the different elements of this disaster cycle, because planning education and planning school safety and planning all the elements related to disaster risk reduction education need to incorporate these elements and adapt to each of the different moments that we will have on this disaster cycle. So another element that I want to introduce here, because it's very important when we are talking about humanitarian, we are talking already about some elements that has been integrated on the agenda of humanity. On the agenda of humanity, we have 5 core responsibilities that are prevent and end conflict, respect rules of war, leave no one behind, work differently to and need, and invest in humanity. And each of them, they have different elements that are called transformations that we'll need to incorporate or take into mind when we are doing the part of the humanitarian response. So it's very important to here to clarify or to put into consideration that within the what we will call the element number 3 of leave one no one behind, we have this transformative action that is to ensure education for all in times of crisis. And that means that we will need to eliminate those gaps in education for children, adolescents, and youth people, and that we need to secure that education is safe, inclusive, free of exploitation, and protected from attacks and abuse of military groups in the case of conflict, but also safe, inclusive in the case of specific disasters and emergency situations. So this is something that we need to have in mind when we are talking about the humanitarian part of this disaster cycle. So one of the most important things, and this is what the Nexus makes a lot of sense now, is how we create coherence between development and the humanitarian actions. Normally, humanitarians work in the urgency of the emergency, and this is very important to understand. So we are in an emergency, and the work that we're going to develop as a humanitarians in the context of that emergency related to the education sector needs to be adapted to the moments of the emergency. Instead of that, in the contrary, or in the opposite of that, we're going to have development actors that try to implement long-term actions that normally are related to the national development plan, with other strategies like the National Disaster Risk Reduction Planning or like the National Adaptation Planning that are long-term actions that are planned not in the moment of crisis. So as we call it, in the moment of peace and calm. And it's very important to try to have a coherence between these actions and these actors. Why? Because the first action that is implemented by humanitarian actors became most of the time on the first actions of the development agenda and actions. So if humanitarian actions do not take into consideration development perspective, their implementation could jeopardize the long-term vision and aims of development. Similarly, if development actors do not plan for emergency situations, so let's say on our planning of education, if we don't consider the need to plan for a specific crisis or moments of crisis, the work of the humanitarians becomes more difficult. So this is where we need to link both aspects of development action and humanitarian actions in order to secure as much as possible that we don't perturb the education of our kids and that they can really be as much as possible as resilient as much as they can. Saying this, I would like now to introduce, just 1 minute. Okay, now I would like to, I don't know why it's not working. Okay, I just want to give you an example here about the case of Somalia and the humanitarian response plans and how humanitarian and development coordination architecture was established in Somalia in order to align the elements of the National Development Plan and the elements of the humanitarian response plans. Because this is very important. It's the importance that we can coordinate elements that will allow to develop those actions that are related to the long-term implementation of development and those actions that are really related to the crisis situations. Because this coordination is what will ensure that we don't perpetuate the humanitarian crisis and that we can really base the education and the school safety on the long term for development. So as you can see in this graphic, since 2017, they put the National Development Plan in Somalia enter into the implementation, as well as the humanitarian response plans. And this, since 2017, started to become a good coordination between development actors and humanitarian actors in order to align the collective outcomes that the both of the plans will have by 2022. And this is why allow that there is not a lot of distortion between the learning outcomes of children, and also about the plans that we have on the education sector, and that we can align both plans in a line of times that, as you can see here, in 5 years we align them both, the development and the humanitarian response plans. So that brings us to the humanitarian and development peace nexus. And when we are talking about the humanitarian and development peace nexus, there are some interpretations that has been now actual or on the table on this specific case. There is the first vision, that is the distinct but complementary. So that means that we need to safeguard humanitarian principles, acknowledging the comparative advantage of humanitarian and development actions, but they see completely two different elements that are complementary between both of them, and they look in a context specific manner. So they are managed in a way, but there are two distinct things, but at the end they need to be complementary. And there is another approach about this specific nexus that are the merge but principle nexus, the approach, of this nexus. So what does it tell us? And it's more in agreement about what I was saying to you before, that the humanitarian action should support the sustainable development goals. As I said at the beginning, the first brick of the humanitarian response becomes the long-term brick of the development aspects. And it sees the distinction between humanitarian and development assistance as an obstacle to effective crisis response, and therefore seeks to break down the silos between the two, and says that context should dictate when humanitarian principles should be upheld and when not. So that means that the whole articulation should be done since the development plans that will include response and humanitarian actions, and in the humanitarian actions that links, for instance, the elements that the humanitarian actions are implemented with the development planning that we have. So like that, we merge both of them together, and we don't see it as a two separate but complementary actors, but a merged actors that are doing the same kind of work in order to avoid many distortions in the actions of the different actors that are working in the times of crisis, in the times of disasters, or in the times of peace, or in the times of normal situations. So this is how we can interpret the triple nexus. So there is the humanitarian and development nexus, the humanitarian and peace nexus, and the development peace nexus. And when we interact development, peace, and humanitarian response, we have the triple nexus, and this is where we merge both or triple the agendas that we have. One on disaster risk reduction, the other one on development, and the other one on peace, the maintenance of peace. This we're gonna give it in the third part of this presentation. I'm gonna explain this graphic and how we link this with the comprehensive school safety framework and with the education in emergency. But just to let you know, the same graphic now in a more actual and examples ways. So for instance, in the short term, we talk about the emergency response. And when we are talking about the emergency response, we have a specific objective there. And the specific objective here is to respond temporarily to the immediate needs. And one of the examples, let's talk about the wash and about the water and sanitation elements that we need to incorporate in schools. So for instance, the most important part on the emergency response is to secure the distribution of wash kits, the construction of water points in the camps. So how we can secure the access to good and quality water in schools or in camps in the case that we are responding to that specific crisis or disaster, conflict, etc., etc. So it's a very short-term objective that has a specific way about how to address it, and that is focusing on responding temporarily to the immediate needs. And this overlaps with the stabilization and responses, where we're going to have a different objective here. The objective here is to restore the state preceding the crisis. So how we're gonna integrate those elements that come to the emergency response, and how we're gonna start stabilizing the situation in order to go out from the response activity. There we're gonna have already an impact assessment, and how we can start really rehabilitating the whole elements that we have. And for instance here, the example that we produced, that we were mentioning in the first part of the emergency response, In the stabilization response, we are talking, for instance, concerning water, about the rehabilitation of water points and support for resilience of these things. And this is something that not goes on the short term, this is something that goes more in the middle term. And it's something that, if things doesn't go good, you need to go back to need if deterioration has been produced, and sometimes you really go back to the emergency response aspect. The idea is that you can advance as much as possible in order to fulfill not only the short-term objectives and the middle-term objectives, but go in the long-term objectives and start working on the development of the responses in the long term. And here the objective is completely different. It's completely different about the immediate needs. It's completely different about the stabilizations that we need. It's more about moving forward and improving the situation that could be one of the elements that create vulnerability or that create that conflict or crisis situations that create that emergency. And at the same time, we are overlapping between the middle term to the long term, and we are talking here, taking back again the example about, for instance, on water, about the construction of new water points and strengthening the capacity of the actors. So elements that normally are in a development plan, on a water and sanitation plan in the long term, and that need to include elements that take into consideration the possibility of emergency response. So in the long term, we plan for the emergency. We don't wait for the emergency to start planning. And this is something very important that we will be discussing in Module 7 when we were talking about education in emergencies. The other thing is that, unfortunately, these situations sometimes are not so linear. We are talking, for instance, about complex protracted crisis scenarios where we have different crises that are happening at the same time. We have, for instance, droughts, famines, conflicts that are happening, so on which one we need to have immediate actions, but at the same time we are combining with middle-term actions and with long-term actions that we have been identified as a priority within our plans. So we need to conciliate the way on which different actors, for instance, the health service actors, the livelihood, the local governance, the basic service deliveries, all of them enter in a way that we can create a good way and a good wave in order to set the basis for development while doing humanitarian response, and we're trying to stabilize the situation. This is what normally you're going to have when you are planning on education. It's very rare the context on which one you will have linear elements for planning, and normally we are talking about more complex protracted crisis scenarios that we need to take into consideration, on which when you're going to have the need for emergency response that are combined with middle-term actions and with long-term actions. And the coherence that you could bring on the planning between these two elements, these three elements, is very important, because that will secure a school safety and disaster risk reduction education in the long term. So, how we overlap these elements that I have just mentioned now with the comprehensive school safety framework and education in emergency. So, if you remember the first graphic that I was showing you when we were talking about peace, when we were talking about emergencies, and we were talking about development, here is how we're gonna start seeing these things, and we're gonna see it more clear as the modules are passing. The comprehensive school safety framework will provide most of the elements that are based for the development, for really planning for the long term, for preventing, for mitigating, for protecting schools and for protecting the educational systems, and of course children. The peace and conflict risk reduction education, together with disaster risk reduction education, climate change education, sustainable development education, will bring us all the elements that will try to stabilize the situation. And education in emergencies is the kind of education that you put in the times of crisis, in the times of conflict. And this is where the comprehensive school safety framework really aligns with the different elements of education in emergencies and the education that is needed for stabilization periods in order to bring the triple nexus here. One example of this, when you are developing curricula. So when you are developing the curricula, you normally develop curricula for a long process with no kind of issues. But this curricula, at the same moment when you are doing the development of the curricula, should integrate aspects of what could happen if an emergency arrives. and you have to have a specific framework for adapting the curricula in the case of an emergency. This is something that we'll be discussing, as I mentioned before, in Module 7, but it's important that you start understanding why development and humanitarian actions are very important in order to stabilize situation and secure long-term goals in the education sector. So, saying this, I'm just gonna finish with this slide on which one we have some good practices about how to bring the humanitarian development piece nexus. So for instance, in different categories, on the analysis, on the planning, on the programming, on the coordination, the leadership, the funding, the monitoring, and evaluation. And these good practices in this nexus will allow us to avoid some kind of risk that can emerge if we don't apply them in a good way. So for instance, if we don't have a regular multi-sectoral joint humanitarian development, conflict, and political economy analysis, the thing is that what we can have is the risk to have fragmented problem analysis and response strategies that are completely atomized and that do not coordinate between each other, and that can bring us to the trap of the humanitarian cycle. So being in the continuous emergency and emergency response and never go back from the crisis states to a more stable state where we can implement plans in the long term. Another example on the planning, if we don't have, it is important, so the recommendation or the good practice to have a common framework for international community and link all plans. If we don't have this thing, the risk is that many plans will reduce effectiveness, plus the diversion risk. So which means that we need to try to bring coherence between the plans of development plans and the humanitarian and stabilization response plans in order to see that they are connected between them and that we are not talking about different plans, and when we go to talk with the different people that we need, either at the national level or at the department level or the local level, that they really don't understand in which part of the process of the planning they are. On the coordination, the centralized and empowered subnational coordination is very important. If we don't do that, we have the risk that untimely decisions that will not reflect the context needs. So we really need to coordinate with the local places where the crises are happening, but also not when the crisis is happening, but also coordinating since the moment that we are planning in the long-term actions. So I leave this table here where you're gonna see the good practices of the humanitarian development peace nexus and the risk of not applying these specific elements on the different categories that we need to take into consideration when we are doing planning, starting from analysis, from planning itself, for the programming, the coordination, the leadership, the funding, and the monitoring and evaluation. It will be a pleasure. I will see you very soon in the next modules. Now we're going to pass to module 1.5, where Dr. Kamal will be discussing and making the case of the economic case for safe schools. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you are enjoying this MOOC until now. Have a nice day.